Okay, today I'm delighted to be joined by Kit England, who's a senior climate resilience and adaptation specialist at Paul Watkiss Associates. He's also a committee member at the British Standards Institute, inputting into the ISO 1490 series, which are all about adaptation to climate change. So thanks for joining us today, Kit.
You're welcome. Nice to be with you.
Maybe we should start by defining climate change adaptation, just so people listening know exactly what we're talking about. So, how would you define what you do?
Okay, so I guess there's a few different definitions out there. There's a very formal scientific definition, but really what we're talking about when we talk about climate change adaptation is about helping people and infrastructure and systems adjust to the fact that our climate's changing. So, we hear a lot about net zero and mitigation and cutting emissions, which is really important, incredibly urgent. But at the same time, there will be a certain amount of climate change that's locked in, and we're going to have to deal with that. And every day that we keep emitting, those potential impacts get a bit greater and a bit more challenging for us. So my job is more about helping businesses, helping governments think through what the implications of those things are and what they ought to do about them.
Brilliant. So we'll get into the weeds of that in a second, but it's I've always found it's quite a niche subject. There aren't that many people who do climate adaptation. So how did you first get started?
Oh my goodness. So I've had a foot in adaptation for a long time. And I started on my master's. So I did my master's on adaptation to climate change as my dissertation. When I did my master's in King's College in London, I was doing environment, politics, and globalization. And that was sort of back in the day where you couldn't go off to, say, the University of Edinburgh and do like a master's in carbon finance or anything like that. The field wasn't very mature. So I did a sort of general environment, politics, and economics type masters, but I was really interested in adaptation, and so I did my dissertation around the UN processes and kind of civil society and the role of adaptation. But then I sort of carried that through. I started working when I first met you actually at Newcastle City Council, when I was a policy officer there on climate change. I worked a little bit on adaptation as part of the climate change strategy and have continued to do so since. Yeah.
Yeah. So where would you say what's the state of play then globally and nationally here in the UK on adaptation?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's mixed, right? I guess the sort of headline goal, if you look at things like UNEP do an adaptation gap report every year, and what they'll tell you is that we're not on track to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And there's a huge amount of work to do, and that is definitely true. I guess historically, adaptation, a lot of it has been a developing country type issue. So there's a lot of countries whose economies are maturing and who are also kind of feeling the brunt of those impacts now, because the impacts of climate change are, they are global, but they're very local and context specific. So, the impacts of climate change in North America are different to the UK, in the UK is different to Europe, etc. So I guess it's been there's a very big gap. In developing countries, they've been doing a lot more, and that's partly because the UN processes kind of are set up to support them to adapt, and that's where a lot of the global climate finance is going. And I
Yes.
guess in Europe we're perhaps a little bit behind. So lots of the evidence, so the European climate change risk assessment or the UK climate change risk assessment says that there's a lot more that we need to be doing to build resilience to climate change. And that's things that we ought to be doing now to make sure that we're adapting well over the next 30 to 50 to
Mhm.
80 years, to the end of the century.
Yeah, one of the things I mean, for somebody who's knows a bit about adaptation, not a huge amount, I visited Portland, Oregon, probably about 8 years ago, and they had sustainable drainage swales across the whole city.
Yeah.
I think I read somewhere that, or I was told by somebody at the council, there was at least 1,000 of these, and yet here in the UK, which also, as we know, recently has been suffering from quite a lot of rainfall, it seems to be sporadic. So you get some very, very pretty, very well engineered ones, say beside King's Cross in London and some other parts of the country. And it seems to almost be, we seem to be largely at the pilot stage of that sort of public drainage issue, just to pick one out of the many issues of adaptation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably fair. I guess there's a huge amount of research and information out there. In the UK, you're right, we're sort of at the piloty type stage. I guess some of that comes down to governance. So, for example, in Scotland, they're a little bit further ahead than in England because there's a lot of legal requirements in the Climate Change Act in Scotland. For example, on public bodies to adapt to climate change. So every public body in Scotland has to report on what it's doing. And the Scottish government supports that with a capacity building program. So the Adaptation Scotland program supports businesses, it supports public sector bodies to think about those issues. But I guess the other thing is that because of the impacts of climate change being very sort of local and context specific, there's quite a lot of role for cities in governance, right, in terms of coordinating, coming up with the strategic plans of what the risks are and what we ought to do about them, and then working with businesses, with civil society to kind of develop responses and things. But I guess it's not been as much of a priority as the mitigation agenda for national government as well.
Yes. The other irony, of course, is some people who argue against climate mitigation, they used to argue that climate change wasn't severe, but now they say it's severe, but we can adapt to it, which is
Yeah. Well, I think it's really, I mean, it's an interesting argument that gets put forward. I don't really buy into it. I think, the reality is there are going to be some limits to adaptation. That's the first thing
yeah.
to say. And we don't quite know where they are, right? So that's the sort of, to give it a metaphor, that's the equivalent of saying your house is on fire. It's quite a big house, but you probably think the fire service might turn up and might help, but you don't know. So the kind of, but the reality is, I guess we're going to need to do both. And you shouldn't sort of, there's also a sort of narrative going around that is adaptation is giving up. And it's really not now. We're at the stage where, the kind of there's a need to do urgent mitigation, but we've emitted so much, already that we're going to need to do some adaptation. But we also know from the economics, from goodness, the Stern report years and years ago that the costs of doing nothing are very high. The costs of adapting are kind of cheaper than doing nothing, but then the costs of mitigation, are even better because actually that reduces the amount of adaptation you have to do as well. So it's not really an either or anymore. It's a case that we have to be doing both, I think.
Yeah. The other issue, bugbear of mine about adaptation is people seem to look at the symptoms rather than the cause sometimes. So they'll want to build huge concrete channels for rivers to try and stop them overspilling rather than looking at watershed management further up and actually, trying to improve the natural processes that will hold that water back. That's just a particular frustration of mine.
I think it's challenging because I think there's the IPCC highlights that there are synergies and trade-offs between mitigation and adaptation. And so there's going to be and when we talk about that, there's synergies and trade-offs in terms of effectiveness, but also carbon intensity and lots of other things. So, nature-based solutions are really great for, certain types of flooding. So they're really good for nuisance type flooding, and they also have lots of different co-benefits like carbon storage and dealing with urban heat islands. But when you look at what happened in China, the recent flooding in China, despite the sponge cities concept being applied at scale, the sort of level of impacts were incredibly high, and infrastructure was really significantly affected. So there's a trade-off there, and nature-based solutions also depend a lot on lots of different governance mechanisms. So they can be really difficult to deliver because you need lots of different stakeholders working together. I'm a big fan though. I do like them and I think they're important, but there are going to be cases where that's a better option, because of all the different co-benefits. And in other cases, you might need the effectiveness for adaptation, in which case flood defenses are important and you need to think about the carbon content of those. So there's been loads of really interesting innovations in things like zero carbon concrete.
Yeah.
But You also see it going the other way, which is that we're building huge amounts of infrastructure for green hydrogen, and a lot of those are going to be in, water scarce places in future.
Yes.
So there's a kind of, there's a question about, well, do we want that kind of infrastructure? And if so, how do we adapt and how do we make sure it's resilient and how do we adjust? So there's lots of different things to consider. And I think that's why, but we're making lots of decisions now where there are long-lived implications for both mitigation and adaptation. And that's why it's really important to think about them together.
Yeah. Can you mentioned this phrase that I hadn't heard before, sponge cities, which sounds quite self-explanatory in a way, but perhaps you could expand on that because it's quite a fascinating
Yeah,
word.
so it's a kind of movement that's been happening in China and has been spun out sort of globally. And it's the concept of using green infrastructure and water storage and things to see cities more like sponges.
Yeah.
So when we have heavy rainfall events, there's enough infrastructure there to soak up the water, and then kind of following that to then I guess release it gradually into the system in a way that doesn't cause large sewer overflows or flooding or surface water flooding or whatever. Yeah, so that's the kind of concept.
So, would that manifest itself in the drainage swales and things like that I was talking about
Yeah, so
before?
it'd be similar to lots of sort of blue and green infrastructure like you've seen in Portland, Oregon, and you've seen in bits in London, and yeah, places like that.
Right. Because one of the fascinating things about Portland is because of the way that planning is delegated in the US, they had a policy where all stormwater, if you wanted to make a development, whether it was housing or a office block or whatever else, you had to deal with all stormwater on site. It was part of the planning regulations.
Yeah.
And it sort of manifested itself within Portland that almost every office block had a garden, so it brought a lot of other benefits into the city. It was just a much more green in the literal sense city than I expected.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting. A lot of these things, there's a huge role for regulation in terms of mobilizing adaptation and action there. I guess, it's really difficult because there'll be a pushback in terms of costs and businesses seeing that as a cost. But actually, quite a lot of this is also about getting the narrative right, and framing a lot of these things properly. Because actually, the cost of doing that will be less. Okay, it will vary from case to case, but in general, the sort of aggregate costs of putting some of those things in are less than the costs of flooding. I mean, I think you look at some of the estimates of the costs of flooding in terms of economic costs rather than just kind of costs to individuals, and they're massive.
Yeah.
We looked at goodness, it was a long time ago, but I remember working with the University of Nottingham looking at Newcastle
Yeah.
and the 2012 flooding in Newcastle, and the cost out of the local economy was 73 million in a day. And that's huge amounts in terms of lost productivity, in terms of lost economic performance. And we sort of don't talk about it in that terms, sort of adaptation. And it's a bit like net zero used to be for a long time. It used to be put in the environmental box and kind of put over there, when actually it's really fundamentally an economic and social issue as well.
Yes, probably for people who don't know, in 2012 we had Thunder Thursday, where a supercell thunderstorm decided to unload a huge amount of water on the city of Newcastle in one day. I was out on my push bike at the time, and it was it June or July? It was early summer and uh, mid-afternoon, and the sky turned dark green. All the street lights came on, and all the birds stopped singing. It really did feel like the end of the world. It was quite a shocking event, and the scars are across the city to this day.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I guess the point is that, those costs are going to affect the public and the private sector, so it's not just going to be, at the moment, a lot of those risks kind of, it's assumed that that falls to government to do something about.
Yeah.
But as we start to see more of the impacts and more of the costs, hitting the public sector and hitting society, there's going to have to be more of a public debate about who should pay for those, for adaptation and why should they pay for them, and that's really important to get to that point. Up to now, there's been a kind of, it's been seen in the distance as something that we eventually we might have to do, but now, government's got some real challenges because it's sort of, it's already in a fiscally tight space. and then the kind of costs of adaptation are going to be very big, and the challenge will be is who pays for what. I think
Yeah.
that's the kind of thing that we've got to start thinking about, you know.
What we've been talking quite a lot at the sort of city level. Is that, would you say that's the best level to look at climate adaptation, or is it or national, or is it, down to individual organizations? What granularity sort of works,
So
delivers
it's kind
most?
of that's a really good question, and I don't think there's a single answer to that. But what I would say is that I think the kind of thing that's really important is the governance is probably more important for adaptation than it is for mitigation. So, there's lots that businesses, for example, can do on their own on mitigation, like insulation or energy efficient lighting or those kinds of things, which can't necessarily be the same for adaptation. So things, in a city or a region, you'll need things like an early, a flood forecasting system or
Yeah.
a heat. We have one in the UK. We have a heat health alert system. But I guess that so there's lots of things that businesses need government to do and local government to do, but then there's also things they can do themselves. The challenge is the coordination. So thinking about the risks that places face, and then who's doing what to help manage those risks. And I guess our experience or my experience is that I've worked in two different cities. So I worked in Newcastle and I worked in Glasgow. And our experience is that kind of place-based, like city or regional scale partnerships are brilliant for that kind
Yeah.
of thing, because it's the sort of scale that local slow down a minute, Kit. It's the scale of like regional economic geographies.
Yeah.
So, the local economic systems work at that scale, the transport systems work at that scale. So the systems that you need to build resilience to generally tend to work at that scale. That's not saying that there isn't a role for government. There's a massive role for government in terms of the financing, the policy, all of those things. But the delivery really, is about sort of regional scale, because the kind of main actors are at that level, and you kind of have the level of understanding about the risks that you face and how they manifest themselves
Yeah.
at that level as well. So, flood risk is a national issue, but it's only when you get down to Newcastle scale or a Manchester scale that you understand, right, okay, where is the water flowing, what are the interventions that you need to do to deliver that.
And presumably the resilience issues, like how our ambulance is going to get to and from a hospital if that flooding happens.
Yeah, absolutely. But I guess this kind of highlights another interesting issue, which is that we, in the UK, we separate out our emergency planning and our kind of civil contingencies and resilience planning from adaptation. So they sit separately in terms of having separate legal frameworks and separate responsible bodies in government and things like that. And so it can be really hard to like transfer the learning between the two. So when you have a flood event, or you've got your emergency services trying to get through floods and things. How do we make sure that that learning feeds its way back into the long-term planning? And I guess that's the other reason why governance for adaptation is important, which is that the ability to manage your own organization's risks depends on other people. So if you're a business, your ability to get your goods and services delivered or to fulfill customer orders really depends on how well you're adapting the transport network,
Yes.
or the ability for employees to get to work or not, depends on whether the metro's running or not, and so all those things, all those risks are really interdependent. And that's why the governance piece is really important too, because, um, it might not make sense for one organization to adapt just on its own basis, but once you start to join all those thinking up and you see it together, it makes a lot more sense.
Yes. And how do you go about selling it? This concept to businesses, is risk the most important word?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting. There's been loads of efforts over the years, and there hasn't been much in the UK for a while, but it's interesting now. It's kind of trying to take off in the global space. So the UN have just released the UN climate champions have just released a really good new report um, on business action for adaptation and resilience, and a few of the big consultancies out there have done it too. And I think the narrative is around kind of avoiding, or there's a bit in there about risk in terms of avoiding costs. so whether that's, damages to premises or lost orders or, all those kinds of things. But then there's a piece about opportunities. So some businesses will make goods and services that can help you adapt to climate change. Some of them will spot new market opportunities coming from changes in climatic shifts. So, goods that were produced in some parts of the world might not be able to be produced there anymore, and they might be in different places. I mean, you kind of see that in UK wine, for example.
Yeah.
Like, it sounds crazy to be talking about it now, but we have a fairly decent wine industry in the south of England in a way that we never used to. So there's an opportunity piece there, and then the other piece I think that we say to business is that it's around collaboration. So it's around, there are mutually beneficial outcomes for governments and businesses, but they're going to have to work together on them to make it work. So that might be providing, government providing guarantees or subsidies or tax breaks, to do the right kinds of things. But we're in the really early days of that kind of discussion, where actually there's a huge amount of work to do on developing costed adaptation plans. One of the things that the Committee on Climate Change criticises government for is the sort of not knowing what we're adapting to. Yeah. And that's a really difficult thing, because it's political as well. So there is an element of saying, well, to be able, just like on, say, decarbonising the housing stock of the UK, you've got to get some numbers about what it will cost and think about who will pay for it. You've got to make some decisions about how many are heat pumps, how many are, how much insulation, all these different things. But adaptation's harder, because you're sort of saying, well, there are some people we might not protect, or there are some places we might not protect, and that's a really difficult conversation, and you sort of have to go through that conversation to be able to get some numbers about what it might cost to deliver those things and who should pay for them. And I kind of think the UK's not had that conversation yet, actually. I think we ought to, really ought to, but as it is, we sort of set some budgets for particular hazards. So like the Environment Agency has a £5 billion flood investment program, and it looks through where does it get the best value for money for investing that money, the best level of protection for investing that money. But we've never had, there's never been a public dialogue about, do you want to keep, the coasts? Which bits of the coasts do you value? Yes. How do we support certain people? Do we support people under certain incomes? Do we support people of certain characteristics? Do you know what I mean? Kind of, you can cut it lots of different ways, but to get to the point about what are you going to pay for, you've sort of got to have that. And to do that on a strategic level, you've got to be able to have that conversation. And that feels a very difficult conversation to have, I think. Yeah.
So what are the, I suppose, what are the issues that you find it hardest to get through to people? It's a particular, flooding's sort of quite obvious because we can see it. But obviously there are other adaptation issues as well, and they will vary from place to place, whether around the world or around the country. So what's the hardest sell to make?
Goodness, that's a good question. I mean, I guess a few different things. So the first is around, there's a huge amount of uncertainty on adaptation planning. So, when you're thinking about this, you've got multiple climate futures. So we could be we're not on track to be in line with the Paris Agreement, but the world could turn it around in 10 years and, deliver large scale emissions reductions. And if that's the case, then you're dealing with a very different set of assumptions by the end of the century than you are now. Yeah. So I think trying to get people to think through the sort of timing of the risks and the timing of the decisions are really important. And we struggle with that. So there are decisions we're taking today which lock in risk, all the way through to the end of the century. So particularly things like infrastructure, constructing infrastructure. Once you've built a new bridge or a road, it's very hard to move. It's very costly to retrofit. But that infrastructure, judging on what we did in the Victorian times, we're still using that infrastructure today. So they have very, very long lifetimes. So I think that kind of is one area where it's really challenging to people. And then I guess the other is around, what was I going to say? I can't remember. No, it's gone. I'm sorry. But that would be, oh, no, that was the other thing, is that everyone tends to focus on the hazards. So like the rainfall or the flooding or the heat waves, but they focus less on the differential impacts, so the vulnerability, and then the adaptive capacity as well. So the kind of ability of individual organizations and people to, develop responses. And I think that's something particularly, adaptation's getting a lot of traction now in the sort of international finance space and in the private sector, with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and the International Sustainability Standards Board kind of bringing forward these disclosure frameworks. But what's getting lost a little bit in that conversation sometimes is that kind of it's not just what's called physical risk, i.e. exposure of buildings to heat waves or exposure of buildings to flooding, but it's also about how well prepared institutions are to respond to that and how people are affected differentially. I think that's really important, because otherwise we risk leaving certain people behind, or we sort of underestimate or overestimate our ability to respond to these things as well and to address them successfully,
Yeah. Yeah. So if somebody's listening to this and thinking, well, we haven't thought in our organization whether we're making widgets or whether we're part of the NHS or whatever, we haven't thought about this. We've just been talking about reducing carbon emissions. What would you advise as their first steps?
Well, it's
Apart from
interesting that
picking up the phone calling you, but
yeah.
yeah,
I mean, I guess there's a few different things. The classic way is to say do a risk assessment,
yeah,
but actually, I'm not always convinced that that works for everybody. Because it's sort of I don't know. Every organization you'll find has a sort of different entry point, and risk assessments don't really pull at the heartstrings either. I think that's the other thing. Is kind of, the thing that I would sort of try and do is coming in and talking to somebody is try and work out what matters. Right. So, if you're engaging at a senior level in an organization, even if it's a small business or it's a large multinational or it's government or whatever, think about, well, what's the purpose of the organization and how does climate change impact that? And I guess that's the sort of, that for me is always the starting point. So, if you're working with a government or with a regional government or a local government, you say, well, look, climate change is going to make the ability to do the things that you're meant to be doing so much harder. Right. So if you're in a government, it's, it could be things like delivering healthcare or delivering economic growth or delivering, that's another debate for another day, by the way. But, delivering economic prosperity, if we use that as a shorthand, achieving those things is going to be very hard. If you're flooded out, if your staff can't get to work, if your costs of borrowing are higher because, of your being at risk, etc. So, or it could be about a business model. So it could say your business model isn't viable in a 2-degree world or a 4-degree world. What are you going to do about that? So it's kind of about trying to work out what matters to people and then trying to think about the intersection of that purpose and the impacts of climate change. And then obviously there is a really important case for, doing the analytical work that you need to do, to really get a sense of these things. But that's the first thing, is if you can work out what matters, and then you can work out what's the analysis that you can do to make progress, to allocate internal resources, to think about, what are the early wins, etc.
Yes, because you mentioned healthcare, and that's my limited experience of adaptations generally been around healthcare, and obviously it'll completely change the demands, on the health service if we're getting more heat waves, if or even mental health issues to do with dramatic climate impacts as well. So it was very interesting digging into that, because it was much more than, are our computer servers in a basement server and could get flooded out, or access to around the city to for ambulances and that kind of thing.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. The sort of demand on the NHS is likely to change as a result of climate change, with, new diseases and pests and diseases, the impacts in general. And then you kind of layer in all the, organization specific things like you were saying, like, the risks as well to, buildings and assets and things. And it becomes a kind of really quite worrying picture, yeah. But that's kind of, once people I get I guess, get to that stage, then it starts to become a bit easier to get agreement to, allocate a member of staff or fund a few research projects or consultancy support to get you going.
I mentioned the three ISO standards. I'm not familiar with those. I assume they're in the usual ISO plan, do, check, act cycle, Deming cycle of continual improvement. Are they a way in for a particular organization to start looking at those standards?
Yeah, absolutely. And what they sort of do is they tend to formalize the adaptation cycle. So there's a standard sort of adaptation cycle that's been used for, goodness, at least sort of 15, 20 years now, which says what you really ought to do. It's sort of in the idea of plan, do, check, act, but
Yeah.
it's in the sort of form of assess your risks and opportunities first, then plan your responses, implement them, and review. So um, it sort of starts from the what are your risks of climate change, and I this is where I say I think the risk assessment is not always the most effective. It's more systematic because you sort of go line by line through your organization about what are the risks to buildings, what are the risks to people, what are the risks from different hazards,
Yeah.
etc. But you end up with a huge amount of information, and sometimes it's very hard to distill that down into like sort of the two or three bullet points or the elevator pitch. So I sort of try sometimes to go the other way around, but the ISO cycles do give you the guidelines for how to do that as well. So they do 14,090 is the sort of general process. 14,091 is sort of risk assessment, and then 14,092 is a particular one for local government as well.
Right. And you mentioned two or three points. Was that what you would recommend an organization sort of boil it down to rather than sort of trying to do everything to find two or three priorities?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that whole old question, isn't it? How do you eat the elephant? It's kind of like, well, one bite at a time. And
Yeah.
I think, the first thing you can do is get started, and it's much better to do that. And kind of do one area properly than trying to be across everything and not really getting much insight or getting really much traction around delivering things. I think it's much easier once you can kind of, if you've got a concrete set of actions or you've kind of taken actions to deal with particular challenges or risks, definitely helps you then think about what you ought to do next.
Yeah. So I think I can see that, particularly if you're trying to get traction for action, in other parts of the organization, is instead of trying to do everything, prioritize quite seriously to get. I suppose that if you're looking at the bigger risks, that's fear might spur people into doing something about it, and then you can have a wider conversation about other maybe slightly lesser impacts.
Yeah.
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 Right. Well, that's absolutely brilliant, Kit. I think we've been through a huge range of things from the international picture down to the organization level and the ISO standards. So just leaves me to thank you for your contributions today.
No, you're very welcome. It's been lovely to be with you.
Cheers.